We have been looking at the way that different communities of people, either back through history in what we're calling the great civilisations, or across the world in what we today call indigenous people, basically people who have kept their cultures from time immemorial, how they deal with property. And we've seen lots of ups and downs and changes. What I want to do this morning is tie that together, at least from a historical point of view, and see if we can come out with some overall conclusions. To do that, I'm going to look at about 3 millennia of history and the way that culture has changed. We've looked at the Greeks, we've looked at the Romans, we've looked at the Germanic peoples and their influence on Europe, and we've finished with modernity. We're going to be looking at modernity in more detail later on, but let's look at what we can see as a pattern. I'm not fond of the idea that history repeats itself, but I do think there are patterns that can be seen. When we looked at Greece, and really the Greek Empire started at the end of what was called the Greek Dark Ages, or the ancient Dark Ages of Greece, which is sort of curious because we normally think of only one Dark Age in history. The Greek culture rose to quite extreme heights between the period about 800 to about 400 BC, as we know. What I have plotted there on the solid line is what I would consider to be the trajectory of Greece as a civilization, as a political and cultural force. And it rose, had a peak, and it fell away. We also saw that at a time a bit before its cultural and political peak, Greece had a change of heart in terms of the way the culture saw itself operating. That happened largely under the influence, or not actually under the influence, but the sophists came along at the time when this change was happening, and they saw the, shall we say, entrepreneurial opportunity and sold to the young Greeks the ideas the young Greeks wanted to learn. One of those was absolute private property. The overall package that the sophists sold was an amalgam of philosophical ideas that enabled them to justify things which previously had been considered unethical and immoral. And so what we saw is that under the sophists there was a major change of direction in Greek ethics. That preceded by at least a century, maybe more, the change in their political and cultural fortunes. And so the dotted line tracks their ethical trajectory, which previously had been kind of pretty much in harmony with their cultural trajectory. With the changes in Greece and their fall from cultural strength, the civilization of Rome took over, and we saw that Rome wisely adopted the good things that they found in the various cultures that they absorbed into their empire. Some of those things included Greek art, Greek literature, and a lot of Greek thought, even the Greek pantheon of gods under different names. And Rome did the same thing. It rose culturally under a particular ethic and system of property. It had an ethical change around about 1.5 centuries BC, which tracks that red dotted line. But that preceded, and in Rome's case, it preceded by 5 or 6 centuries, Rome's eventual political, technological, if you like, and civilizational demise. which was largely underway by about the 2nd century AD and was certainly coming to bits big time in the 5th and 6th centuries. And we saw a similar pattern in the Germanic culture, which came in by way of what is unfortunately referred to as the barbarians, re-civilization of the West, its strengthening culturally, economically, politically, over that period up until about 1300, 1500, somewhere around there. And then an ethical change that was initiated in the life of Machiavelli, probably a lifetime either way. And then there was again a tendency towards a different ethic, a different approach to property, and a different approach to culture in general. Meanwhile, the West has continued to be strengthened politically, economically, technologically, and we explored where the technological edge of the West came from with that event around the year 1100. So there's a pattern there that we can see when we look at the long history of Europe. We could write pretty much the same story if we were to look at China, a simpler story if we were to look at India, and perhaps in some kind of microcosm, something similar in South America. In other parts of the world, they haven't been through the booms and busts here. There is an interesting case in Hawaii where basically all of this pattern of cultural rise, ethical decay, eventually cultural decay happened. In Hawaii, it all happened in the 19th century. I'll leave that for you to explore in your own time if you like. And it also had an extraordinarily important property dimension. We simply don't have enough time to cover every part of the world. But here we can see 3 instances of the same process. Down in the bottom of this slide, there is a reference to a chap who's not on the readings, maybe next year. I might put him into the readings, Carl Zimmerman, Family and Civilization, who in about 500 or 600 pages goes through pretty much these patterns with an awful lot more detail and a couple of other cases as well. Okay, what do we have here? We have a pattern which includes not simply the rise and fall of empires, but also the rise and fall of ideas and institutions. In particular, the institution of property, and related to it, an entire attitude of relationships between people with respect to their material interactions. And we need to explore that a little bit further because we can see the importance of property here. What we can conclude from this story is that cultures grow when using common sense and a sense of cohesion for ethical direction. Now, they're pretty charged words, and we might come back and unpack that later on. When you talk to an Aboriginal person, an indigenous person, a person, say, from Tonga or Fiji, one of the things that stands out is that while they might believe in some things which you or I may not believe in, they do speak with an abundance of common sense. They believe, for example, that what they see is there, and they believe that what they know to be true is in fact true and not simply an opinion. Oddly enough, cultures like ours are of the opinion that there are only opinions, that we cannot know anything with certainty. Now, I would say that doesn't stand up to the test of common sense. It takes an awful lot of education to discover that you don't know anything. I'm going to put onto this diagram property institutions. We saw in Greece that the early part of the Greek period was significant because they used a system of property very similar to what indigenous people use today. I'm going to describe it as communal property. That's not communist property, that's communal. Two entirely different ideas. However, once we got to that nasty period when Socrates was standing around wondering where the wheels had fallen off, they had arrived at the discovery of radical, absolute private property. And that's what basically gave the cities their economic power. We've seen that. So we see a transition from communal property to absolute private property. Now we're talking here about absolute private property, which is an important distinction from conditional or limited private property. There's worlds of difference between them. When we look at the empires or the civilization of Rome, and for that matter the West, we see the same pattern. Rome rose under an institution of property which was communal, clan-based, and it decayed under an institution of property which was very much similar to our absolute private property. And we saw the same thing with the West, especially when we look at the institution of property known as feudalism. One way or another, feudalism enabled the cultural wreckage, which was the end of Rome, to rebuild itself into the kind of cultural, technological and economic success that was happening around the 1400s. Okay. I don't want to use this slide right now, so I'll go on to the next one. I've mentioned ethics repeatedly, and I'm going to be arguing that the institution of property is an ethical decision, an ethical institution. We're going to be exploring that later on today. And people now tend to talk a lot about ethics. You guys are going to have to follow the Australian Property Institute's ethics if you want to go into practice as property economists and so on. And we're very, very concerned about ethics, except that just about nobody today knows what ethics is. Most people think that ethics is doing what you think is right, or doing what you feel is right, as though it's a matter of an opinion, a feeling, something that somehow we are born with. Now, that idea, I would argue, came roughly from a period of history known as the Enlightenment, the 1700s. There have been a number of major ethical systems and a myriad of smaller ones over history. And what I want to do is just briefly go through some of the ethical systems that we've seen lurking behind the story on the previous slide. Greece, Rome, the West. We've already spoken about the sophists in ancient Rome. The sophist philosophy, or philosophy of life, could be wrapped up in a one-line statement: seek pleasure and harm no one. And I think we did mention at the time that was a wonderful ethic because it meant you didn't hurt anybody and you simply went about your business enjoying yourself as best you could. So how could you fault it as an ethical system? We also noted at the time that it wasn't a very useful ethic for soldiers to have, because if you followed that ethic, it would be unlikely you'd go over to Afghanistan or what have you, or Iraq or wherever Australians are kind of fighting these days, put yourself in the firing line to get shot at. That doesn't necessarily increase your likelihood of enjoying your life as pleasure. And especially when they put a gun in your hand, an RPG or something, the idea of not harming anybody goes out the window as well. The other thing about the sophists is they went out of their way to convince the young Greeks especially that there wasn't anything objective, anything that could be known with certainty in ethics, that it was simply an idea or a set of ideas that was a matter of feelings. And if your feelings changed, then your ethics could change. That largely enabled the Greeks to go about and change their approaches to many things, including each other, that eventually lowered the level of cultural cohesion and enabled the Romans to come in and take them over as a people. We noted the ethics of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. That system of ethics is objective because Aristotle especially, and to a large extent Plato, but not quite as systematic, was really arguing that things are knowable and ethical ideas can be known, at least some of them, with absolute certainty. I don't have enough time to go into, a class or two on the nature of moral philosophy, but I would say that it's possible to argue from the position that humans are equal. We all come with the same DNA, basically 46 chromosomes and all the rest of it. From that premise, which we can know with certainty, the cold-blooded killing of an innocent person is taking something from somebody that you definitely don't own. It is always and necessarily an immoral act. It is objective. It's not simply because Australians think that murder is a bad thing and maybe someone else on some pirate island think it's a good thing. That was Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. We'll describe that system as objective, and their maxim comes down to do good and avoid evil. Now those two maxims, seek pleasure and harm no one, compared to do good and avoid evil, can be seen as extremely similar. They both have two parts. They both have a positive side, do good, seek pleasure. They both have a negative part, or a part, something to avoid, which is, don't do something, don't harm anyone, or don't do evil. They appear very, very similar. However, the devil's in the detail. What does good mean? For the sophists, good, when you think hard about it, and again, we don't have enough time to go into this in very much detail. If I am no more than a bag of bones, then the only thing that ultimately can be good for me is things which are pleasurable. And so good becomes equal to pleasure. And so in some ways, the sophist maxim and the Aristotelian, Platonic maxim appears to be actually synonymous. But we have to think long and hard about whether good extends only as far as pleasure. This is an idea that comes back again in and out of the history of human thought. I don't know if you call him a philosopher, Mortimer Adler, who was the editor for Britannia's Great Books series. Some of you might be familiar with the Great Books. There's about 20 or 30 volumes. And when Mortimer Adler drew together all of the great books, his object was to collect all of the significant writing through the written history of humanity, certainly through the Western tradition. And his opinion was that if you look closely and become familiar at this history of writing, from the sophists right up including Freud and 20th century philosophers and so on, all of these books, these great writings that people think convey wisdom, Adler is of the opinion that you see a conversation written in through this history of ideas, and one of them has to do with the nature of what it means to be good or to do good. And if you look at that conversation, whether good equals pleasure or something else is part of that conversation. It's an argument that you can have between somebody in the 15th century to somebody in the 5th century BC, or maybe even in the 10th century BC. Let's move on now. The Romans developed an approach to philosophy known as Stoicism under Seneca. Epictetus gave the Romans a subjective ethic. Their maxim was virtue is the only good, and in Roman thinking, virtue became perilously associated with physical strength and perhaps economic strength. It was ultimately a subjective form of ethics, and its impact on Roman culture gave the Romans the moral authority, if you like, to steal each other's land and to assassinate each other and do a number of other unpleasant things. Oddly enough, the activities that flow from Stoicism aren't necessarily what the Stoics themselves advocated. But that's a study for some of you if you want to study the history of philosophy further. We noted that the rebuilding of the West came under the influence of the Germanic tribal people, basically indigenous ideas, something that we could see perhaps in indigenous New Guineans, Papuans, Fijians, Africans. Those ideas were alive and well in the Germanic tribes. They eventually gave rise to the medieval culture, which largely did what the Romans did, in that it went out and absorbed those things that were good and true from previous cultures, and the ethic of the era also adopted the Aristotelian maxim of do good and avoid evil. It was objective, and as we've seen, was a result for a strengthening culturally, economically, technologically of that people. That was replaced by the thinking of Machiavelli, which was explicitly and almost brazenly subjective. Appear to do good or appear to be good and use evil, I will say, pragmatically. If evil benefits you, then do it. But always look like a good bloke. If I want to be the burglar in Borkham Hills, I want to appear like I'm somebody that you'd vote for to be the local mayor. I want to appear to be a good man so that everyone likes me, and then in the evening after dinner I sort of, put the stocking over my head and go off and, do whatever I do. And Machiavelli gave us that idea. The Machiavellian idea was to a large extent perfected during the 18th century, in the 1700s, by thinkers such as David Hume in Britain, Voltaire, Rousseau, and a number of others in France, who were known as the Enlightenment thinkers. They gave us a moral system. I haven't given you the maxim, but I have given you the title, known as moral sentiment. Moral sentiment is the belief that there are no moral principles at all, none at all. But what we have is the feeling that we have in us when we are born. So people have a feeling of repugnance when we see somebody mugging somebody else. There's nothing in itself bad about mugging people. It's just that most people feel bad when they see it happening. And so we bunch together, form a society, and say, let's stop this thing which makes us feel bad. Let's make mugging illegal. And that's where ethics come from. And whether we're talking about perjury, theft, murder, whatever, the moral sentiment would say that if I want to find out what is good or bad, I just sit in the corner somewhere, look at my navel, and think about what feels bad to me, what feels good to me. Now, the Enlightenment thinkers were wanting to justify a number of things which, in their time, were considered to be less than wholesome. It gave us the economic behaviour that basically filled the prisons in England and eventually spilled out and then colonised places like New South Wales, Tasmania, and other parts of our fair country. Lastly, we move to the last major ethical system, known as utilitarianism. That was championed by two thinkers, Bentham and Mill, John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. It is very subjective. Its maxim, and you may have come across this already, because utilitarianism is the ethical system at the foundation, the explicit foundation of modern neoclassical positive economics. When you study economics, you are studying a system which asserts its independence from ethics, but is built on the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. That utilitarian ethic is what is lurking behind Homo economicus and the whole idea that the most effective economy is the one which produces the greatest amount of economic benefit for the greatest number of people in the community, for the community in general. And so we use measures like GDP per capita as a measure of economic success, because GDP per capita is the measure of our economic benefit divided by the number of people, and as long as we get that single number maximised, then we think we're doing a good job with our economy. More generally, Bentham and Mill would see that as long as the majority of people are happy and a small number of them are sad, then we're doing all right. And if we can make more of the people happier and less of the people sad, then we're moving in the right direction. And one of the curious things, if you look closely at utilitarianism, and especially read Bentham and Mill, things like issuing everybody with a standard ration of marijuana would actually be an ethical benefit for society, because everyone would be happier. And if you took people who were depressed, unhappy, if you get the heebie-jeebies, a bit of dope, some people get a bit paranoid, well, you just go out and shoot them, right? And every time you shoot somebody who is going through a bit of paranoid, sort of depressed stage, you're actually making the society better ethically, because you've got more people happy and less people sad, and so from a utilitarian point of view, you're actually doing a wonderful job. Utilitarianism, while I might be taking it to absurd lengths, is basically that system. And to a certain extent, some of the arguments that are alive today in our society tend to rely on utilitarian justification. And so, for instance, and I don't want to go too far into this, because we're doing property economics, not ethics, but when you think about it, if in this room there was somebody who was a bit unhappy, and we were to say, just go into the next room and you will be happy no more. Okay? Because you're feeling unhappy and life is not worth living. Okay? We are following utilitarian goal of the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Okay? And I'll let you fill in the blanks as to what political issue or what have you is right now being debated, that is arguing that we should allow people who are a bit unhappy to go into the next room and not come back. We live within that ethic. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people in some parts of Europe, especially the northern countries, are afraid, if you're about my age or older, to go into a hospital. Because some people might consider that you're not as happy as you should be or as productive as you should be, and you don't come out again. We live in interesting times. So what we see is a variety of ethical systems. Now the big question is, we've now got, say about half a dozen, 8 or 10 of the major ethical systems through this past 3 millennia set up on the board. And you can say to yourself, well, which one am I going to choose? Somewhere you'll find a paper of mine on just terms of compensation, where I go through these ethical systems applied to compensation law and look at the different outcomes that come from them. One way or another, we've got to get an idea of what just terms of compensation is. And depending on which one of this list we adopt, you actually come out with different results. Which one is better than the others, or simply a matter of, you deciding in the privacy of your, own room or whatever, which ethical system you're going to follow. Kind of curious to see, because ethical systems are important for culture, because to a certain extent, each of us has to have some confidence in the ethical system of the person that we're dealing with. If you come into this room uncertain of which ethical system I am using, then your likelihood to be able to trust me is diminished somewhat. Let's imagine I am a real utilitarianism, and I come in and say, class, I'm going to make sure nobody fails. By the way, there are some people who didn't go very well in the essay. Just come out into this room next door. And I make sure that I have no failures in my class. I don't think you would feel very comfortable coming into class. Maybe there are a handful of people who have discovered that already, which is maybe why we have a few empty chairs today. I don't know. But you see, civilization has to do with being able to trust the other in your society. And the only way you can do that, especially when you're dealing with humans who are creatures who have intellect and will, is to be able to be confident that when this other person that you're in relationship with uses their intellect, their mind, and their will, their decision to do good or evil, they're not going to be ripping you off. If that's the case, if you are afraid that you're going to do that, then people won't be involved in any kind of a relationship and you won't have a civilization. I wouldn't be able to sort of drive over the hill to trade with the town next door if I believed that the town next door were cannibals and they're going to eat me. Okay. So the importance of having a common ethic is extremely important. Okay. I think we've pretty much got the words on this slide already under our belt, so we'll move on. We can see that they rise, so civilizations rise with objective ethics, fall with subjective ethics, and we see a parallel with the institution of property. This is not Small's opinion, this is history. And you see parallels also with family values. So it looks like understanding a little bit about ethics is pretty important if I really want to understand economics in general, and property in economics and property rights in particular, especially if you ever have the likelihood of interacting with people from other cultures, like seriously other cultures, which today would be largely indigenous people. And so our Mabo issues and Aboriginal land rights absolutely require this kind of an understanding to really get your head around it properly. I'm going to give you a couple of definitions. First of all, ethics is the polite word which currently is being used when we really want to talk about moral philosophy. I think that the word ethics still has a kind of positive spin to it, positive connotations, where the word morals in our culture is considered to be something else. To be moralistic or what have you is to be a bit of a stick in the mud, a bit intolerant and so on. It has negative connotations. However, formally, ethics is the product of the doings of the science of moral philosophy, where moral philosophy is the study of principles for appropriate relations between intelligent beings. And an ethic is no more than a set of moral principles. And so we have a set of moral principles particular to the medical profession, because they have different challenges in their profession than we do in the property industry, property profession, where to be a valuer, we have a set of moral principles which make up the ethic which is appropriate for property valuers, and so on. To understand ethics and understand morals in general, moral philosophy, we have to understand, or at least engage, in a number of other areas of human understanding. And I'm listing some of them here. The foundation questions to understand ethics have to do with metaphysics. And metaphysics would ask the question, do moral principles exist? Because metaphysics is the study of existence. What sorts of things exist, how they exist, what the limitations to existence are. There is also an epistemological question. Can we know morals? Morals might exist, but can human beings actually know them for sure? Can we know that the cold-blooded killing of an innocent person is, in fact, a bad idea, immoral, always and everywhere? Can I know that? Maybe it might be there as a principle, but it might be as unknowable as whether or not there's life, on the third satellite of Alpha Centauri. There may be or may not be life on that planet. I don't know. And right now I can't know. I simply don't have access to that knowledge. Maybe questions like, is murder wrong? Is selling lies wrong? Is mugging people wrong? Always and everywhere. Maybe that's something simply unknowable. And maybe it exists as a principle, but I may not be able to know. That's an epistemological question. Epistemology is the study of how we can know things. It's a branch of metaphysics. There is a later question, an ontological question. Ontology is the branch of philosophy that has to do with the practical side of how things exist. Metaphysics asks the question, do they exist? Can they exist? Ontology asks the question, can they, or how do they exist? So are morals things that relate to particular cultures? When one culture believes in cannibalism and another one does not, does that mean that cannibalism is right in Fiji sort of 3 centuries ago and wrong today? Are moral principles the sort of thing that depend on the century or on the hour of the day? Could it be that private property is a good thing 500 BC, but a bad thing in 200 AD? And if that's the case, maybe murdering somebody might be immoral at 9:30 on the 12th of October 2018, but it might be reasonable at 10:30 on the 12th of October 2018. And I'll take the people that aren't going very well in the class into the room next door. There's the last question, which is an applied question, applied science question. What sciences or science do they impact? Now, this probably comes as a little bit of a shock to be using the word science in the context of philosophy. I would say that science is any human activity that has to do with the pursuit of certain knowledge. And in fact, science has been defined as the pursuit of certain knowledge through cause, basically through logical connection. And so we can ask the question, what sciences are impacted? Now, that really leads into the question of how the sciences fit together, okay, and whether philosophy is a science or not. To do that, I'm going to take you through what I will call the classical order or hierarchy of sciences, which is a very important insight to have because it helps us make sense of all of our world. We can do that especially now that we have been surveying different cultures and civilisations and approaches to human doing over the last few weeks. We're going to start with what I'll call the natural and applied sciences, or the practical sciences. The natural sciences include sciences such as physics, that should not be physical, it should be physics, chemistry and biology, anatomy, geology. In fact, any science where the person taking interest in the science, doing the science, does it for its own good. The chemist, the pure chemist, simply does chemistry because he loves seeing what things kind of bubble up in the test tube. Or I've got a couple of boys at home and they love trying to find out what things go bang in the backyard. They pursue chemistry for the simple joy of understanding the insights that it brings. And the same with physics. Then the natural sciences, pursued for their own worth. They're contrasted to the practical or applied sciences. And in the practical or applied sciences, I'm going to start with engineering and medicine, although I'm most interested in the practical or applied sciences of law and economics, and there are a number of others as well. Music could be considered to be an applied science. Why is engineering, especially say chemical engineering, different to being a chemist? And the difference is that the chemical engineer uses understandings from the natural science of chemistry for some applied purpose. He might be wanting to make a better detergent, or maybe a stronger type of plastic. And so the chemical engineer is going to be using the insights of the natural sciences for the purpose of some human, often social application. And the same with civil engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, and the rest. So it's always the application of a natural science for some human good. Because the practical sciences are always aimed at some human benefit, a good, they always have an ethical element to them. Because ethics has to do with the notion of good. Moral philosophy has to do with goodness and badness. And so a good civil engineer will design a bridge which might go over a river and will not fall down. That's a good thing for society. A bad civil engineer might take the money, design something pretty hurriedly, and then leave town, because 6 months after the bridge is built, it'll fall down, killing hundreds of people. Okay, which is a very irresponsible way to do civil engineering. He's a bad civil engineer. The same with the others. Medicine is the application of biology, anatomy, chemistry, physiology for the good of the human person, to bring health. The biologist isn't necessarily interested in whether someone's healthy or sick. They're simply interested in what goes on. I knew a fellow who did his PhD on an enzyme that lived in the stomach of the grasshoppers out in the Western Division of New South Wales. Now, he wasn't particularly interested in what that enzyme did to society, but he knew an awful lot about it because he did his biology very, very well. But somebody else will come along and use that insight for the purpose of making some insecticide or doing something so that the farmers won't lose half their crop because of the grasshoppers. When we get to economics and law, we say, well, what natural science does law and economics use? Well, in fact, they don't use very much at all. We could maybe stretch our imagination and say that economists are a little bit interested in production and factories and computers and stuff, but it's probably stretching the friendship a little bit. There's something else that the practical sciences, in fact the natural sciences, use to pursue their sciences. And those things are other sciences that help them make sense of what they're doing. If we look at physics, especially, say astronomy, and if you read any book on astronomy, you'll find very quickly that you'll be reading a lot of very heavy-duty mathematics, because the astronomer makes sense of what the stars are doing by writing all sorts of extraordinarily complicated equations. And so one way or another, sciences such as physics especially, but also the other sciences, chemistry, biology, anatomy, geology, all use a certain amount of mathematics. I would say that mathematics is certainly a science because it has to do with certain understanding. But mathematics, while it's pursued for its own interests, in my youth I tended to be a bit of a pure mathematician. I just enjoyed it, just a pursuit, just the fascination of understanding how differential calculus works and stuff like that. But most mathematics isn't used for its own purposes. It's used to help do other things. The natural scientist uses mathematics to understand astronomy, physics, laws of Newton, all that stuff. Likewise, the engineer uses an extraordinary amount of mathematics. We would call mathematics a science of review. It is a science which is used in practice to help make sense of the other sciences. The classical term for the sciences of review are the queen sciences. The queen sciences are always those that rule the lower sciences. They are the sciences of review. The sciences of review are really come into two groups. One is mathematics, which we've spoken about, and you're fairly familiar with. The other is philosophy. The various branches of philosophy, we've already introduced some of them: metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, and so on. We've also been introduced to the science of morals. There are other philosophical sciences, mainly logic. Logic is about as delightful as mathematics in terms of its intellectual rigour and what it can do for helping the other sciences. It'd be pretty difficult being an engineer if you weren't logical, for instance. I won't go into the details, but you can't be very good as any kind of a science if you don't have a sound metaphysics. And there's been a battle going on over metaphysics for the last 500 years in our culture. That gives us the major practical side or practical dimensions of the various sciences. So under this schema, mathematics is a science just as much as physics is, even though mathematics deals with things which are not knowable because they're not concrete. They've got to do with things like 2 + 2 = 4, where I can't see or touch or measure with a scientific instrument either the 2 or the equals or the 4, but I know them with certainty, and I know that they can tell me things and they have a form of existence. I can say similar things about the branches of philosophy. Good philosophy is common sense. There are other types of philosophy which are possibly not so much. Some philosophies are very popular because they allow people to do what they want, such as Machiavelli's Prince, and other philosophies tend to build civilisations, such as Aristotle and Plato. As well as these sciences, in our walks through the different cultures and peoples that have inhabited the planet, we've encountered another organising set of ideas which can also be considered as a science. And so it's improper to leave it out. Because if I try talking to an Australian Aboriginal about their property rights, and I don't include their theology, I won't be able to get far with my conversation. Because the Australian Aborigines, like the Papua New Guineans, the Africans, the South Americans, the South Pacific Islanders, or indigenous people just about anywhere on the planet, will all tell you that their science all begins with theology. And theology includes a number of things which can be known with certainty. They tend to extend well outside of the realms of what's sitting on the table in front of us. So that gives us the complete classical order of the sciences. Using that classical order, I can communicate with people of any culture. I can't do that if I don't have the entire schema sort of somewhere in the back of my mind. So now you're equipped. Let's move now to look at what I'll call scientific ethics. Scientific ethics requires confidence in knowledge, in other words, a sound epistemology. It requires a certain confidence in what is known to exist, or a sound metaphysics. And it requires dispassionate deduction. In other words, the connecting of ideas from premise through connections to conclusions. In other words, sound logic. In one way or another, a sound ethic, any sound ethic, will have to be stable. It will have to be bigger and more permanent than the individuals who subscribe to it. There's no point in having a room full of 100 people with 100 different ethics, which in 10 minutes' time are all going to be different. You won't be able to have any kind of human society on that basis. The ethics have to be stable and they have to be nobly objective. That's, if you like, the shopping list for what I should look for when I go looking for an ethic for myself. Some rule to live by. It's certainly important when you go looking for somebody to have some form of relationship with, either personally or socially or as a nation. When Australia goes and negotiates through diplomatic channels with some other country, one of the things that we have to be confident of is that our diplomats are not going to be murdered and eaten or something. And so there are some countries you simply wouldn't bother going along to talk to. There is a story about a European political leader who was visited once by some people from the East. And when the people from the East appeared before them, they were all wearing turbans. And this political leader said, "You must not wear a hat in my presence, because that's one of the rules of my country." And the visitors from the East said, "Well, this is our religious custom, we have to do it." And they said, "Fine," said the religious leader. And so he ordered his officers to find a hammer and nails, to which he attached the turbans to these gentlemen's heads and sent them home. I don't think the diplomatic relations between those two peoples went very much further. That story comes from the story of the real historical Dracula. He wasn't a very nice man. So regardless of whether we're looking for someone to get married to or a country to have an international treaty with, we need some sense of knowable, objective and stable ethics to underlie our relationship. We mentioned epistemology. A sound epistemology has to do with confidence in knowledge. There's no point in me saying I don't really know if I exist or not, or I don't really know if you exist or not. I mean, it might be nice over a coffee or a beer or something to have those conversations. I was once sitting in a rowboat in Lithuania as part of a conference I was attending, and there were three philosophers, actually, four of us in this little rowboat, and three of us were trying to convince the fourth that this fourth philosopher actually was in the boat with us, and this person was of the opinion that she couldn't know for sure, and we were seriously contemplating whether to throw her in the water or not, just to give her a little bit of a nudge, but we thought that would be impolite. But there are people who seriously don't think that they know anything or can know anything. David Hume, who is known as the father of British empiricism, the father of modern philosophy, or one of the fathers, certainly in the British tradition, wrote in one of his books that when he is doing philosophy, he is not sure whether his maid exists. However, he writes, he found it more convenient to believe in her when she brought in the afternoon tea. And that's pretty much the sad state of modern thinking.